But B, and I think this is something a lot of people are missing, you're not really playing like PIOsolver, and the fact that you're trying to imitate the program without understanding, you're kind of looking down Alice's rabbit hole and seeing a tiny bit, and really that's more random noise than anything else. You're really making your game worse. You're really making your game worse. You're really making your game worse.
This year, Ross Glover, a coach over at Red Chip Poker, released an early edition of his book Unbeatable Poker, which is one of the first poker books written about GTO play. Unbeatable Poker breaks down the same range across 24 flop types and close to 50 different flops. Each chapter in the book examines one board type and shows how to play that board using a base range called the NIT 100. This should cover some 80% of all flops. In each chapter, Glover shows a Nash equilibrium between a player opening 7.5% of hands, exactly 100 combos, against a player who flats 19% of hands, or 252 combos. Now, before I go into this book in more detail, I want to talk about why this book in particular is special to me. First, my entire YouTube channel and much of my modern poker career revolves around studying, teaching, and analyzing exploitative poker through the lens of a solver. Whenever new training materials come out, I'm always interested in seeing how other professional players and instructors approach the same material. Second, last year I wrote a review of Optimizing Ace King where I called it the worst poker book of 2018, and I was curious to see if Unbeatable Poker could do any better. Considering how little published material there is about solvers, I thought that this would be an extremely easy feat, because virtually any new information would be fresh and exciting. I have to admit, Unbeatable Poker surprised me in every regard. I didn't know it was possible to fuck up a poker book so badly. The question isn't if Unbeatable Poker is the worst poker book of 2019, the question is if it's the worst poker book written in the solver era of poker. Of course, as a rival coach and instructor, you should take everything I say with a truckload of salt. So, rather than just give you qualitative opinions and come off as an unscientific hater, I wanted to give you technical, quantitative advice on why this book is so bad, backed up with a solver, the very tool this book relies on for authority. If you had to write the worst possible book on game theory optimal play, what would it look like? It would probably explore arbitrary preflop ranges without testing conclusions across various ranges. It would focus on what to do and not why, without discussing how to comprehensively create strategies. It would use a single bet size and openly refuse to test popular alternatives. It would design extremely ugly charts for no reason. Like, seriously guys? I'm supposed to memorize this? It would brute force solve 50 flops rather than trying to extrapolate patterns from 4 to 5 flops, and it would present solutions that are flat out wrong. Remember that video at the beginning about imitating PIO without understanding the theory humming underneath? This book does exactly that to the nth degree.
You're really making your game worse. You're really making your game worse. You're really making your game worse.
If you want to learn GTO, here's what you should do instead. Don't use one preflop range, use many. The deeper in GTO study you get, the more you realize that optimal play revolves around which player has proportionally more combos of the effective nuts. The key word here is proportional. So for example, you raise 19% of hands from middle position, and you get called by 9% of hands on the button. When the flop comes 9-7-2 rainbow, both players can have all combos of sets, but the player with the 9% range has proportionally more sets in his range, and he's the one who gets to dictate the size of the pot. As you can see, PIO recommends that we should never c-bet into this proportional advantage. Understanding these proportional relationships is the first key to understanding how to proceed post-flop. When you raise 7.5% of the time, and you match it against a 19% caller, you can't even notice this proportional relationship because the caller's range is so wide. On 8-6-2 rainbow, a flop where NIT 100 cannot have any combinations of sets, PIO still suggests that you bet nearly 100% of the time, even against a caller who can have all combinations of sets. This is because Villain's range is so wide and air-heavy that Villain struggles to make minimum defense frequency, which would be folding about 40 to 45%. Villain has to fold 51% on the flop, and all the losses from overfolding are not recouped by having 9 combos of sets out of the remaining 236 combinations of possible hands. What if you faced the Nit 100 against a tight, predictable 7.5% pre-flop caller? You should check nearly 100% of the time. The in-position caller has such a proportional nuts advantage that you cannot possibly inflate the size of the pot profitably. If we pair the Nit 100 against a 9.5% caller, we should c-bet a little less than 40% of the time. It isn't until Villain's range expands to 11 or 12% of hands that you actually can begin betting nearly range and take advantage of their inability to meet the minimum defense frequency. By using only one pre-flop model, the author not only misses the chance to recognize many of these relationships, but it skews many of his models to be 100% bets when in reality you should be betting closer to 50% or 0% of the time. At the very least, the author should mention how wildly your c-betting frequency should change against variant opponent types. Also, there is really no justification for playing a range this tight in the first place. If you're playing at a table where players are flatting 19% of hands against you in position, you should be playing much more loosely to press your talent advantage. Personally, I would open a range something like this that include pocket deuces and all of my suited aces, especially if I knew one or more fish was going to call me in position and it was likely that I could see a multi-way pot with a premium multi-way hand. You should focus on why GTO is choosing its lines and what it's trying to counter. Don't focus on exact hand combinations and frequencies. If you focus on playing hands exactly like PIO, you are not improving your game. PIO is extremely sensitive to exact blockers and designing strategies that revolve around pinpoint ranges that you'll probably never have, and if you misread your opponent, your models will be completely off. Unbeatable Poker isn't a book about how to play optimally as a 7.5% raiser against a 19% caller. It's a book about how to play optimally when you both have exactly the ranges given in the book. Here's what I mean. Let's go back to this example where Nit 100 gets called by a tight 9% player, and the flop comes 8-6-2 rainbow. As we said before, Nit 100 can only bet 35% of the time because it has so few combinations of sets, and Villain has a narrow range. However, if you add in 8-8 to Nit 100's pre-flop range, which is only a 6-card difference but it allows the Nit 100 to have top set, you'll see that our c-bet frequency goes from 34% to 72%. That's a wild swing in c-bet frequency from only adding in 6 combos, and it shows you exactly how volatile these strategies can be with imperfect information. If you're even slightly off, your strategies can change night and day. So you have to ask yourself, how likely is it that you're going to face opponents who flat exactly the same 19% range as they recommend in the book? If your answer is never in my entire life, then you've also described how often you should follow this book's advice. This book is a study of noise that unfortunately took years to write. However, this isn't just a study in noise, it's an extremely superficial study in noise. Here's an example from 10-9-2 Rainbow giving an overview on how you should play the flop. Quote, should the opponent raise the continuation bet on the Rainbow flop, plan to continue around 55% of the time. Most of the unpaired hands will fold to a raise. Only King-Queen suited and Queen-Jack suited do not fold to the raise. All Queen-Jack suited and King-Queen suited in diamonds and spades call the raise, whereas King-Queen suited in hearts and clubs puts in the re-raise. There isn't any actual justification behind these plays, or mention of range formation at all, or justification on why some of your hands should be 3-bets on the flop and some of them should be calls. Instead, Glover literally describes what the solver is doing, and that's it. This isn't superficial analysis, this isn't even analysis. In many of these overviews, Glover literally describes the chart in front of you without adding any reasoning. If you have a solver already, this material adds nothing to your comprehension of how GTO plays. Rather than use one arbitrary bet size, you should use underbets and overbets in your models. To quote Glover, this book does not cover the complexities of bet sizing. As you become more skilled at the game and at playing unbeatable poker, Bet sizing will become more important to building systematically complex strategies. Bet sizes for the purpose of this book range between 60 and 75% of the pot. Okay, I just have to be real with you. This is 2019. Solvers have been around for 4 years now. There's this guy called OTB Red Baron. He's pretty good at poker, and everyone knows that he bets itty-bitty on the flop. This simplification technique has been made popular in online mid-stakes games for years now, and small bets are widely considered best practice by many of the top theoretical minds in the game. To ignore all of this history and technique is to be purposely ignorant of how modern professionals approach poker, and it's doing a huge disservice to the reader. Plus, it complicates your game wildly. Let me show you what I mean. Here, we've solved down Ace 7-7, Nit 100 versus 19% flat, and we've come to a $5.75 solution. However, if we go ahead and bet 33 100% of the time, aka depolarizing our bet, our strategy suddenly becomes a lot easier to execute because we don't have to memorize betting and checking ranges, and almost more importantly, the amount of EV that we make is actually higher than the EV that we make by mixing bets and checks. So let's compare these two options. You can play a mixed strategy that forces you to memorize multiple flop ranges and possibly make mistakes, or you can bet 33% of the time, never make a mistake, and play an equilibrium strategy that makes more money. By ignoring all of the other bet sizings, even in extremely obvious situations, Glover misses arguably the most important part of solver work: simplification. Rather than memorize all of these poker charts, try this strategy instead. On any flop that doesn't allow for a straight or a flush, we can range bet small when we have top 2 pair and 2 sets. This is also probably true on boards where we can have 2 sets and our opponent cannot have top 2 pair, as well as some disconnected king-high boards because we should exclusively have both pocket kings and ace-king. Let's test this theory on the most coordinated possible board that we can have that doesn't allow a possible flop or a straight, while still giving us top 2 pair, and that's going to be Queen, Jack, 7 of 2 spades. So first off, when we solve the depolarized strategy, we will see that we make $5.29 out of a $9.50 pot. However, if we mix between a large bet and a check and do not depolarize our strategy, though we will bet very often on the flop, you'll see that after this solves down, our EV is going to be $51.82, which is going to be smaller. Even on such a coordinated board, betting 1/3 actually makes more money than betting 2/3 and occasionally checking. Doing a little bit more range work, you can quickly see that this top 2 pair theory holds true. On Ace 10-2, when you can have top 2, depoling makes 1 cent more than actually mixing. On Queen 9-7, that's a board where you can have top 2 sets, but your opponent cannot have Queen 9 suited, and so we can go ahead and depole here. However, if you add Queen 9 suited to our opponent's range, I imagine that we can no longer depolarize. On Jack 9-5, this is a board where we can have top 2 sets but not top 2 pair, while our opponent can have Jack 9 suited, and so we are not allowed to depole. Similarly, on 10-9-5, though we can have top 2 sets, we can't have top 2 pair and our opponent can, so we are not allowed to depole as well. As you can imagine, if you know how to study GTO in terms of nuts and preflop ranges, you can just look at the 2 ranges of both players and determine what boards are going to have significant nut advantage for which player. This is way, way less complex than memorizing arbitrary strategies for even more arbitrary preflop ranges. So rather than memorizing these incredibly complex charts, on a large amount of flops, you can look at your hand, figure out who has more sets and 2 pair, and know if you're allowed to check or bet your entire range. By looking at hands through this perspective of nuts advantages, you make way fewer theoretical mistakes than memorizing hideous charts. Hint: if you give PIO the option to overbet the turn after betting 33 on the flop, you get a higher EV even still. Here, by adding in possible overbets to our turn model, we go from $6.40 to $6.45, which doesn't sound like a large amount, but it is an improvement of half a percentage point, but it is an addition of half a percentage point to our EV. However, I wouldn't expect Red Chip Poker authors to incorporate overbets into their game. I once posted about overbetting after betting small on the flop, and Doug Hull, a co-founder of Red Chip Poker and the editor of this book, called models that use turn over bets after a small bet on the flop, garbage in, garbage out. So I wouldn't expect these guys to discover the power of small bet than large bet. Now, this brings me to my final 2 points, and they're pretty important. One, after you buy this book, the authors want to sell you software to study the material. Now, I don't mind upsells. In fact, you could argue my entire YouTube channel is branding of material of one sort or another. But when you create a subpar product that is needlessly complex in order to sell software to study it, you kind of have to wonder about the motivations. Clearly, simplifications exist. They're fairly easy to summarize in tight versus loose scenarios, even when out of position, and they're fairly common knowledge to anyone who takes GTO seriously. So either Glover is absolutely unaware of this approach, in which case his expertise should be disqualified, or even worse, he knows about simplifications and he wants you to use his more complex strategy anyway, and then buy his add-on software. And finally, and this is the least forgivable problem of all, some of the solves are just plain wrong. Let's take Ace-10-2. In the book, Glover recommends betting about 75% of the time. This seemed wrong to me on the surface because we have a narrow range, top 2 pair and top 2 sets. Indeed, when I ran this by PIOsolver, Pio had me betting about 95% of the time using all of the exact same stats as we did in the book. 100 combos from the opener, 19% from the defender, and the original pot is 9.5 big blinds. We have the same effective stacks, and I'm using 66 across all streets with no forced out of position bet. So this is the exact same specifications as the book, and yet here, I'm betting 20% more than what the book indicates. I tried turning off Rake to make up for this discrepancy, but Rake is not going to make up for a 20-point difference in continuation betting. On Queen 7-6 Rainbow, Glover recommends a 79.5% c-bet, but if I let my solver run down to 0.2% accuracy, Pio actually recommends betting north of 96%. That's almost 17% off. I honestly have no idea what's going on here, if the author and the editor aren't letting their solvers work to a high enough accuracy, or if both the author and his editor were too lazy to proofread their work. Whatever the reason is, if you're writing a book that does nothing but describe GTO play without any meaningful strategic advice, don't fuck up your GTO solves. It's really hard to imagine your GTO poker style is unbeatable when you can't even figure out how to use the basic software correctly. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button to see all my latest rants, raves, slam poems, interpretive dances, and advanced poker strategy.